We just wanted to chill, man. We didn't want to have to be vigilant 24/7. And that's what we needed to be. And that's what we have to be. And I guess that exhausting element of democracy is what so many people are willing to relinquish until they find that it's gone.
This is the Rhyming Chaos podcast, where we interview people who have lived through or studied times of great change, when authoritarian rulers began to establish their power, or when old orders fell apart. I'm your host, Jeremy Goldkorn, coming to you today from Nashville, Tennessee, where I live. Today, I am delighted to be speaking to Richard Poplak, an author, journalist, and filmmaker from and based in my hometown, Johannesburg, South Africa. He is the author of many things, including the journalistic graphic novel Kank, a portrait of notorious Toronto bike thief Igor Kent. He's the co-director of Influence, a documentary about corruption in South Africa, co-author of the 2016 book Continental Shift, A Journey into Africa's Changing Fortunes, a senior contributor to the Daily Maverick, which is an extraordinary South African news organization. Richard was one of the journalists behind a podcast miniseries produced by the Daily Maverick called The Highwayman. Its tagline is a true crime podcast about the murder of a country. Yours might be next. Well, now I think the country that I now call home, the United States, seems to be on the chopping block right now. And I think Richard has some experience of what Americans are going through now, what we can expect here in the coming years, and maybe some advice on how to cope. So welcome, Richard, to Rhyming Chaos. We are going to discuss some interesting things.
We absolutely are.
Richard, I think there are a lot of interesting comparisons to be made between South Africa and the United States in the past and right now. But the topic I want to focus on for this podcast today is state capture. As far as I know, the term state capture was coined by someone at the World Bank in 2000 to describe some Central Asian countries, newly independent from the Soviet Union in the 1990s, and where businessmen used their influence over government officials to appropriate government decision-making in ways that would benefit their own bank accounts. But it's a word that has become quite closely associated with South Africa over the last few decades. Is that about right? And could you explain what state capture means and how it fundamentally differs from regular political corruption?
Yeah, and first of all, Jeremy, it's been a long time, and I just want to say thank you for having me on your show.
Oh, it's a pleasure. It's so good to see you.
Yeah, and it's an outstanding endeavor, so thanks for that. So looking back at the etymology of state capture, in a weird way, it's a bit of a misnomer because effectively the transition from communism into what one might call Central Asian democracy or post-Soviet Union, quote unquote, democracy was really just about almost sort of a cut and paste from the old system onto the new system. And in a very real way, that was the case in South Africa as well. So I don't think here we need to educate your listeners about how colonialism functioned as an extraction machine. That transferred onto apartheid in the South African context. So what apartheid was effectively an empowerment scheme for half of South Africa's white population, the Afrikaner half of the white population, who had considered themselves to be under the boot of the so-called English or Anglo-Saxon South Africans for a long time. They took the mechanisms of the state, the big state-owned companies, Iscor, which was the steel company, Eskom, which was and remains one of the largest power utilities in the world. They took those companies and they served as sort of iron rice bowls in the Chinese context as machines for extracting wealth from the country that would enrich a very small Afrikaner elite.
And give employment to the non-elite Afrikaners, stable employment. Yeah.
Of course. Yes. So in other words, stuff the civil service with Afrikaners, enrich wildly a narrow Afrikaner elite, and transform the state as an empowerment scheme for Afrikaners. So we're one to be traveling over South Africa at 30,000 feet during apartheid. One would have quite some difficulty discerning the mechanisms of apartheid from communism in a lot of ways. Now, of course, they were virulent anti-communists, but the way the country run was exactly like that. You had your state-owned companies that fed through to an elite and fed down to a civil service that was almost exclusively Afrikaner. Come the end of the regime and the dawn of so-called democracy, and those mechanisms transfer over to the African National Congress.
And just to be clear for anyone who may be living under a rock, that's the party of Mandela that still more or less rules the country in a government of national unity now.
Yes. So the funny thing is, we can almost think of it as a parenthesis, because South Africa started out as a government of national unity, a co-governing relationship between the ANC and a series of other parties, including the former National Party who had run the country during apartheid. And now we're back at a government of national unity, largely due to the failures that we're going to be talking about today. But right at the beginning, in 1994, at the dawn of democracy, the ANC then took over the mechanisms of these huge state-owned corporations and very quickly understood that the key to enriching a black elite and at the same time as transferring patronage across the massive ANC system, which was always described as a broad church. You have people from all sorts of ethnicities all over the country who were members of the ANC. In order to transfer patronage across the system, they need to take control of the state-owned enterprises and start inserting themselves in the middle of the state and procurement. In other words, the tenders that the state issued in order to build up a country that was exclusively the domain of 4 million white South Africans. So that right there is kind of the key to understanding the notion of state capture. It is a narrow, rent-seeking elite that inserts itself in the middle of the state and procurement. In other words, it's a middleman scenario. So what the ANC went on to do after that was develop the system of procurement, develop the system of enriching this elite, and that was kind of the way that the enrichment or the empowerment of black South Africans writ large was conceived of at the dawn of democracy. So you could see how that sort of sets the stage for corruption at a astonishing level.
And so when did you first start to become aware that the corruption was happening?
So there were two events very early on in the democratic dispensation that suggested that things were going to move quite poorly. The first was the attempt by the Arts and Culture Ministry to mount a sequel to the famous South African play Sarafina. It was called Sarafina 2. And effectively, this turned out to be a huge extraction device that was sucking money out of arts and culture and turned into South Africa's first corruption scandal.
Sorry, just clarify, Sarafina, that was a musical play.
Yes.
It was an anti-apartheid play that was very popular outside of South Africa during the later years, the 80s, essentially, right?
Yeah, it was one of those sort of cultural artifacts that really explained to South Africans, but also to the wider world, how apartheid functioned, therein being the irony. And Sarafina 2 was supposed to be the sort of triumphant, victorious lap that South Africa would do internationally by mounting this production that suggested how the liberation era had now dawned and everything was going to be perfect. Sort of ironic that turned out to be the first real corruption scandal that sort of broke into the South African mainstream. The second, and by far much larger, became known as the arms deal. And essentially, this is where we see one of the major players in South African politics post-apartheid, Jacob Zuma, who had become the president in 2009. Here we see him rear his head and insert himself into the mechanisms of procurement. So the arms deal was effectively a large package of materiel that would be sold to the South African National Defence Force from a variety of European arms manufacturers, in particular the French arms manufacturer defense contractor Thales or Thales. Jacob Zuma's cabal inserted themselves in the middle of this and took huge bribes from this massive tender, and that blew up into a situation that became known as the arms deal. Effectively, that kicked up a power struggle between two factions in the African National Congress, the president at the time, Thabo Mbeki, and his deputy president, who was Jacob Zuma. Jacob Zuma ended up winning that battle, taking control of the ANC in 2007, and by 2009 he was president of South Africa, along with the cabal that had backed him going forward.
And to just backtrack, the arms deal, that was 1999, right? When that...
That's correct.
And at that time, South Africa, I mean, even now, there's no, I mean, South Africa isn't fighting a war. There's nobody interested in invading South Africa. I mean, we don't need an army, do we, really? I mean, aside from the minimal defense requirements of a normal country, but there was no particular need to buy a bunch of arms at that time. Is that correct?
Well, it's funny that you say this. I mean, the first real geopolitical threats that South Africa has faced have emerged in the last 3 or 4 years. One of which is the country that we're discussing now, which is the United States, of course.
The rogue nation. The rogue regime, yeah.
Exactly, the rogue nation. Yeah, the new North Korea. So you're right. South Africa really didn't need. What it needed to do was streamline the South African National Defense Force and make some really smart decisions about how to exercise South African sovereignty within the new context of Southern Africa, which had now been completely liberalized, and it was now time to try to form a regional-wide economy that would benefit the 60 or 70 million people living in Southern Africa. They did not do that. Instead, they bought a whole bunch of military material, which the country absolutely did not need at the time and still doesn't need, and it still doesn't work. So there has been no sort of real legacy of improvement or modernization within the South African National Defense Force as a result of the arms deal. Really, it was pure extraction. There's no other way to describe it. And the rupture caused by the arms deal was so significant that it really did transform the way South Africans conceived of the African National Congress and conceived of the state itself. And once Jacob Zuma came to power in 2009, the whole mechanism of state capture began to formalize in a very real way.
And can I ask, when news about the arms deal began circulating, there were news reports, journalists were writing about it. It didn't seem to affect the popularity of the ANC, as I understand it, or at least not dramatically. I mean, they didn't lose popular support, did they?
No. In fact, their popular support at the time was gaining. And here we come to an important thing about, I suppose, democratic engagement. And that is, when you have a political brand like the ANC, which is so closely associated with someone like Nelson Mandela, but not only Nelson Mandela, a whole bunch of other liberation heroes that did fantastic things, brave things, important things in terms of Black liberation, in terms of trying to transform the country into something free and important. The attachment to the ANC, especially with older Black South Africans and many white South Africans as well, went far beyond the realm of politics, Jeremy. It went into almost a spiritual realm. So the attachment to the ANC was never going to be somehow magically decoupled because of what people felt were perhaps temporary setbacks on the road to a blessed multiracial utopia.
That does sound very familiar. I'm sitting here in the heart of MAGA land in Tennessee, where there are a lot of good Christians who just don't care about anything that Trump does. It's been impossible to dislodge him from the sort of belief system that has grown up around the Republican Party.
Well, exactly. And I think Trump famously said if he shot someone on Fifth Avenue, no one would care. But I'd go even further than that. I think if he was found in a Moscow hotel room with 12 underage male prostitutes, no one would care. At this point, it's gone so far beyond the realm of rationality, and it enters into a realm that can only be described as almost a spiritual attachment. For better or for worse. And I think, that's exactly the case with the ANC. The ANC is not merely a political party. It's not merely a political brand. It's something that has deep, deep roots in South African democratic institutions. In a very real way, the ANC was democratic before there was democracy in South Africa, certainly more democratic in its structures than the National Party or any of the other sort of Afrikaner or English national parties at the time. This was a massive organization which reached every node of society in the country. Very important to remember that. And that's why the attachment was so deep and why it remains so hard to break, even to this day.
So then, 2009, Zuma's president. He could have shot someone on Fifth Avenue. Nobody cared. What's the next phase of state capture?
Well, just to keep in mind the fact that Zuma's character was on display long before he became president. This may resonate with you, Jeremy, in chilling ways, but there was a massive rape trial held against Jacob Zuma around 2005, 2006, where he was accused of raping the daughter of one of his close friends. She was HIV positive at the time. Zuma sex with her, according to her, non-consensually, without protection, and famously said that it doesn't matter because he had a shower following the sexual engagement. Yeah.
Oh, that's right. And then was it Zapiro, the South African political cartoonist, who started drawing him with a shower head coming out of his forehead after that?
Exactly.
Right?
So yeah. Zapiro, an internationally famous South African cartoonist, drew this iconic political cartoon with Zuma with a shower head attached to his head. And to this day, that remains Zapiro's way of depicting Zuma and very much the way many South Africans remember Zuma. But the ANC went out to bat for Zuma. Huge factions of the ANC, including the ANC Women's League, went out to bat for Zuma, screaming outside the courtroom, "Burn the bitch." A whole bunch of real ugly stuff came to the fore in support of Zuma. And that suggests, Jeremy, the attachment that people had to Zuma as a populist figure leading up to his presidency, and should have been forewarning enough for what was to come in the subsequent years.
So let's get into what came in the subsequent years, Richard.
So Zuma had a series of backers from the private sector. Primary among them were a family of 3 Indians from Uttar Pradesh named the Guptas. So the Gupta brothers had, and here's another sort of weird resonance, had a computer company called Sahara, which had sort of inveigled its way into supporting various ANC events over the course of the zeros. But they picked their horse in Jacob Zuma and began to back him, back his lifestyle. Zuma is a man with a large family. He has 5 wives. He has many children. So like any patriarch, he has a lot of admin to take care of. And the Guptas were happy to assist in this regard. As Zuma's presidency deepened, the Guptas made it quite clear that they were Zuma's right-hand men and would become the de facto middlemen among a number of players, but would become the de facto middlemen between the state and the procurement. This is what we were talking about earlier. So Zuma looked around, and being a previous spy himself, understood very clearly that the job right now was to capture every single state institution that had any control of rule of law and subvert those under his control. So the first and most important was the State Security Agency, sort of South Africa's large kind of version of the CIA and the NSA mashed up into a third of the Pentagon. So number one was Zuma putting his men, his people, and his expertise into capturing the State Security Agency.
Sorry to go back a little bit. Zuma had been a spy for the ANC. He was in charge of intelligence for the ANC during the struggle to end apartheid.
Yes, absolutely. So that's an important piece of context. Thank you. So a very experienced intelligence operative, and very wily and very cruel in a lot of the stuff that he's done. So he knew exactly what to do. There were already a lot of his people in the SSA to begin with. So number one was going after the State Security Agency. Number two was going after the police services. Again, much like in the United States with the FBI and the CIA and a whole bunch of other agencies sort of overlapping, prior to Zuma's presidency, there was an independent, corruption-busting police force separated from political control called the Scorpions. Now, the ANC did everything it could to subvert and kneecap the Scorpions, which they successfully did. They were replaced by an organization called the Hawks, which were put under the control of the South African police services and therefore under political control. So now what Zuma had to do was subvert the Hawks, subvert the South African police services, and subvert the National Prosecuting Authority, which was the sort of attorney general element of the state. So he did that very successfully. Took a few years, and one could have been excused if one was feeling a bit sleepy for missing some of the signals. But by 2011 or so, it was very, very clear what Zuma was doing. So it certainly hasn't happened at the pace that you've seen with the kind of tech disruption ethos, the Silicon Valley ethos that state capture is happening in the United States at the moment. It was a much more insidious, a much more Soviet way almost of capturing the state, but nonetheless was extraordinarily successful in its processes.
And so now Zuma is in charge of basically anyone or has control over anyone who could stop him. So how does he proceed then to loot the state? So
it was a really popular notion, especially, I might say, amongst South Africans' white population, to think of Zuma as an idiot, an uneducated Zulu man, interested only in his own libido. That could not have been further from the truth. What he had done was very successfully cauterize any ability for the state to call him out for his actions. Even though there was a lot happening that could, in principle, still stop him, there was the veneer of rule of law. And we'll talk about a couple of mistakes that he made along the way in a minute. But I think to answer your question, what he started to do was take notes from his backers about what to do and where procurement should happen and who should get the contracts. And among the principal beneficiaries of this were the Gupta brothers, who started to insert themselves as middlemen in massive contracts that the states were procuring in order to modernize further. We're talking about billions and billions of dollars in rail infrastructure, in locomotive purchases, in road building. All of the sort of infrastructure stuff that you would imagine a modernizing country like South Africa would need, the Guptas were there. There were a number of other players who were similarly inserted in security contracts. As the state started to come to pieces, of course, one needs to privatize effectively education, security, policing, all of the other elements of the state that the government is supposed to provide, health services, all of those things. The Guptas and other people close and loyal to Jacob Zuma were everywhere across that feeding chain, extracting rents from the state everywhere that they could.
Right.
So that was number one, right? Number one was making sure that all of the middlemen were in place, everybody was getting enriched, and it looped around back to the Zuma family and everybody close to him. So that was number one, start to make real money. Number two was to go further into state capture territory. Of course, as you can imagine, Jeremy, one of the first things you have to do is capture the judiciary. Now, in South Africa, ironically, this is much, much harder to do than it is in the United States.
Yeah, they did it before. They've already done it here. That's been taken care of.
Right, exactly. So because the quote unquote buck stops with the Supreme Court in the United States, which is narrowly divided between right and left, or Democrat and Republican, you guys have a much bigger problem. The Constitutional Court in South Africa is quite a bit larger and is much, much harder to stack. And there are processes that go beyond two political parties bickering over who is going to be a Constitutional Court judge. So while there's many, many, many flaws in the South African judicial process, and many, many, many flaws in the legal process, you still got to be rich to win court cases in South Africa. Nonetheless, capturing the judiciary is very, very difficult. But what Zuma did have was one very important appointment, and that is the head of the Constitutional Court. he appointed and again, here's the resonances, a deeply devout evangelical Christian named Mahweng to be constitutional court judge. There was enormous amounts of consternation from journalists like myself. I wrote a scathing piece at the time about that appointment, that having a hyper-religiously conservative constitutional court judge was a subversion of the sort of democracy that South Africa had hoped to institute. But it turned up to be one of Jacob Zuma's accidental screw-ups, because Mahweng was not particularly well behaved. And Mahweng turned out to have a wildly independent mind, and shock of shocks, took the Constitution as a text seriously and didn't sort of free associate in his interpretations of South African law. So call that a bit of an oopsie on Jacob Zuma's behalf. The second was his appointment of what is called the public protector. The public protector is sort of an oversight office, sort of an Uber ombudsman, an Uber attorney general who gets to investigate at his or her own discretion cases that will come through. So you or I could bring a case to the public protector and say, please investigate my local member of parliament for stealing Toyotas from the local orphanage. Could you please look into that? And the public protector at his or her own discretion will take on those cases. As you can imagine, many of the cases that are of great importance to the public protector's office are government corruption.
Right.
The appointment he made was another religious conservative. Her name was Thuli Madonsela, very experienced, very wise, and as it turned out, shockingly independent woman who did not toe the line in any respect. So
right.
If anyone from the U.S. administration is listening to this and using this as a lesson, make sure about your appointments, make sure that they are doggedly loyal, and make sure that they do not have an independent streak.
Right. So in other words, Trump and Musk, the Trump-Musk junta, they should not appoint another Mike Pence who,
absolutely
was shockingly independent.
Of all people, yeah, who may look into his or her own soul and realize what's happening. So, but for the most part, Jeremy, what I want to emphasize here is that Jacob Zuma and his cabal had taken control of, let's say, looking at it glibly, about 70% of the state. It was theirs. It was under their control. This ran all the way down into the provinces, the provincial authorities, where I'd say about 70% of them were under Jacob Zuma's people, and down into the municipalities, where we should state that's where the real thieving happens, because that's where all of the services come to. Rubbish removal, water, sanitation, road building, all of those things. At every single point in state procurement or municipal procurement, there was a Zuma person stealing.
Right. So this is something I really want to ask you about, because I keep on having the feeling that at some point in the next few months, we're going to see the first signs of what happened in South Africa. And maybe it'll be the failure of the post office, like the post. But I left South Africa in 94, and although I've been back and forth quite a lot, I haven't lived there since then. But I have family there and friends, and when I was first in China in the 90s, the post, we didn't really have email, and post was how we communicated, and the letters would arrive. And then I think sometime in the early 2000s, letters stopped arriving. And then I would hear things, copper got stolen out of the streets, and there was no phone service in parts of Johannesburg, and then garbage wasn't being collected, etc. But I don't have a very good sense of sort of the chronology of that. How did that feel like living in South Africa in those years? How did you start noticing the fact that this corruption was leading to this, in the end, quite extreme degradation of government services?
So, look, systemic corruption cannot be blamed exclusively on Jacob Zuma. I think what I was trying to say with the arms deal, and I was trying to say with Sarafina too, was that corruption was sort of endemic long before he became president.
Right.
It was sort of written into the code of how the democratic dispensation would lead to enrichment for the ANC and its cadres and its patronage system. So right there, if that's what your conception of the state was, state failure was almost an inevitability because you weren't really interested in providing services. You were interested in providing patronage to your people. So right there, the failures started to happen quite early. The biggest one, and what remains an existential threat to South Africa's economic survival, was Eskom, the big power utility that is the power monopoly in South Africa, which as early as 1999, there were white papers written saying, listen, you guys have to build more capacity in order to keep Eskom moving, to provide electricity for first of all, we've got the whole black population now all of a sudden who need electricity.
The country actually has to start delivering services to them.
Keep in mind, all the apartheid regime had to do was provide lights, water, and electricity to industry and to 4 million white people.
Right.
Nobody else. That's Israel. It's a tiny, tiny, tiny community that you're dealing with there.
So when we were growing up, we actually, you felt like you were living, for non-South Africans, we felt like we were living really in a developed first world country.
100%.
You had to go outside the white areas to actually notice that not everyone had nice roads and electricity.
Yeah, or any roads. Yeah. So obviously the roadblocks in front of the ANC were extreme. And we do need to acknowledge that the building and modernizing of South Africa for the majority of its population was not an easy task coming out of apartheid. That said, it was only seldom was it dealt with honestly. And that is the real tragedy of South Africa. So state failure started to appear sort of in the cracks quite early. But then, Jeremy, it really escalated when Eskom stopped providing electricity. And we had something which is euphemistically known as load shedding. This started around 2007.
Which is blackouts.
Yeah,
when
blackouts.
There's no power for hours on end.
Hours, right. Yeah. So, that really felt like the cracks began to show. But as Zuma's state capture mechanisms increased, you really started to see the state fray. And while it took a little while for everything to seep in, the really darkly humorous part of it is that the state has collapsed once Zuma left office. And we'll get there. But the truth of the matter is that South Africa now is in the how do we fix what we've broken phase.
Right. And
that really, Jeremy, take it from me, is the phase you never want to get to because it's real easy to break things. You're seeing it now with Doge breaking things, which is easy to do. Disrupting is easy.
Right.
Fixing and building, not so easy. So, that's the phase that South Africa is in now. And I cannot I cannot overstate how difficult it is to rebuild an aircraft that is already in the air.
Right.
It's one thing to gradually build up a state so that it functions appropriately. But when you're already airborne, real tough.
Right. That's the find out stage. We're doing the fucking around now, but
yes,
we're going to find out pretty soon in the United States how difficult that's going to be.
Yeah, and I say this without a dog in the fight, to be honest, Jeremy. I didn't vote for Donald Trump, and nor did I vote for Biden. South Africans don't get a vote except for Elon Musk in the United States. But I will say that what's being broken right now resembles to an enormous degree, and I don't mean this glibly. I see all the signs of state capture and what is happening in the United States right now, because there really is sort of a chapter and verse element to this process, right? The subversion of rule of law,
right? The
legalization to an extent of corruption, right? And that has happened in the United States. And to a degree, it's what happened in South Africa. The attempt to subvert your public protector. The attempt to install a pliant constitutional court, and critically, the capture of your law enforcement agencies. Right? All of that just means that there is no checks and balances any longer. And without checks and balances, the stealing can continue apace. And all of this, of course, and this is the important stuff, all of this needs a cultural element in order to legitimize it. Right? So in the United States, it's this sense of wokeness, right? We have to remove wokeness from the woke mind virus from every aspect of our government and our cultural context. In South Africa, it was more a sort of leftist, populist, mildly socialist sort of patina of legitimacy that was draped over Jacob Zuma, when in real life, he was a Zulu chauvinist nationalist. There's nothing leftist about the guy. And so those sort of cultural contexts, those cultural legitimizing factors are very, very important to a state capture process. In other words, look for the culture bullshit first. Underneath all of that, you'll find what's really happening.
Right. I mean, that's been very clear for quite some time now. The culture wars in the United States have been probably the most viciously fought in the press and in the media and, well, on social media, particularly internet. And the famous podcast bros like Joe Rogan, the sort of foot soldiers in that war. Okay, so, wow. You're not making me any happier. But I mean, this is not a series of podcasts really designed to make anybody happy, I suppose. So Zuma's taken over. We have state capture. We have massive corruption. Services are starting to fall apart. There is amazingly an incredible free press still in South Africa. And you're a part of that, which I think is extraordinary. And in fact, the press, I mean, if I think the Daily Maverick is so much more courageous than the New York Times, it really is kind of remarkable. Maybe you can just talk about that a little bit.
Sure. So, yeah, I'm sitting here talking to you as an alive journalist, Jeremy. And I think you've said that we're not here to make anybody happy. I do think there are also signs.
If we can, that'd be great.
Yeah. I do think there are also signs that have emerged from South Africa that suggest what is necessary. First of all, as the press, the media writ large in South Africa is, how can I put this, is hyper competitive. It exists in a free market. It's one of the few areas of South Africa that is purely free market. I mean, there's no state backing for media in South Africa. Apparently, we received a lot of money from the CIA. And 3 weeks ago, everybody found out about USAID. Before that, I'd never heard of it in South Africa. But now all the right-wingers were like, you guys were funded by the USAID. How are you going to survive now, you culture war bastards? We're like, yeah, we didn't receive money from USAID, but that's fine.
Yeah, I saw some social media conversation you engaged in with some of those people.
Yeah, it's like, oh, you found USAID. Well done. We've been saying that they're nonsense for years, but anyway, never mind us. So the media, for all its faults in South Africa, and there are many faults, for all its faults, did a unbelievable job of the hard investigative work that it took to break the state capture stories. And when I say break, I mean in the terms first of breaking news, but also getting lucky breaks. So in 2017, the Daily Maverick's chief publisher at the time, Branko Burkic, came into possession of some hard drives that belonged to a lieutenant within the Gupta empire. And if you recall, the Guptas were basically Jacob Zuma's main backers, right? This family of Indians. And what was on those hard drives was revelatory. All the emails, all the paper trail, all the attachments, everything that proved the extent of state capture without a shadow of a doubt. Now, of course, there was all sorts of yelling about how the emails were fake. And of course, when I first heard the news, my first question was, how can we test the veracity of this stuff? The second we went into the hard drives, it was clear. There's no one on earth that can fake. Well, I suppose maybe now with AI you could, but they could fake hundreds of thousands, millions of documents. It's impossible, or was impossible at the time. So we realized we were sitting on not just the smoking gun, but the gun itself, right? So does that make sense as a metaphor? I don't think it does. We were holding in our hands the smoke and the gun,
right,
and the bullets. Yeah, something to that effect. I'm rusty. Got to get back in there. The gun metaphors. So we've got it all, and so we start bringing out at great risk to ourselves, to the whistleblowers, at great risk, we lay bare the mechanisms of state capture from 2017 on. And what that did was pushed the ANC, or the opposing factions in the ANC, to kneecap Zuma, to remove him from the presidency of the ANC, which meant that there was no chance that he would become president of the country, or his faction would take over the presidency of the country for a third term.
Right.
So that victory proves that with an active media doing, now let me emphasize this as clearly as I can, hardcore investigative pieces, not opinion.
Right.
Hardcore investigative pieces. The hard work that gets you in trouble.
Right.
The mechanisms of state capture were laid bare.
Right.
No one could say they didn't know anymore. No one could say they didn't know how it works. The second thing was civil society, who never backed down for a second, who organized protests, who organized and were discredited for this by the likes of myself, to be dead honest, who organized factional arrangements with big business, who were very timorous, much like they are right now, very scared of going after the guys in power. Right? We're talking about old white corporate dudes terrified of calling out Jacob Zuma for his sins, much the way the big business is terrified right now in the United States. But they realized at a certain point, if they didn't want to give up every last dollar to the baddies, they had to get up and actually start fighting for themselves.
So the capitalists actually came around in the end.
Tell you, man, getting a capitalist outside of his easy chair is not an easy thing, Jeremy, but they did, and they came to the table. And so a very wide faction of civil society, I would say at the time, disassociated from us in the media, we gave them all the ammunition they needed, but nonetheless, we weren't part of these factions, stood up and started protesting.
And can we talk about who that was? So you had big business.
Yes.
Who else?
So there were lots of organizations in South Africa that date back to the fight for the rights of HIV patients. Of course, the original kind of anti-vaxxers, or the original sort of state-run anti-science campaign, was Thabo Mbeki's animus towards HIV/AIDS science.
Right.
In the 1990s, where the ANC under Thabo Mbeki and under his health minister at the time denounced AIDS science, said that there's no way that HIV, that a virus could cause a syndrome. There was a whole bunch of bullshit spouted by the government, and they refused to deal with the HIV/AIDS crisis in South Africa head on. Hundreds of thousands of people, millions of people died, hundreds of thousands of AIDS orphans. It was a genocide, Jeremy. But dating back to that, which was unrelated to any corruption crisis, right? It was a crisis of culture, I guess you could say, right?
Right.
Which paved the way, I should say, for Jacob Zuma, but nonetheless was a horrific mistake by the ANC government at the time. Lots of civil society had established itself at the time to deal with the fight against Mbeki. And those, combined with old legacy civil society organizations from the anti-apartheid days, started to cobble themselves together with legal organizations, with pro-democracy organizations, to form a kind of coalition.
So these are, we're talking about non-profits, NGOs, legal advisory groups that were not set out for the, how to put it, I'm being very inarticulate here, groups that were already dedicated to fighting for the common person.
Yes.
Right?
Yes, absolutely. And I think they're constructed a little differently from how they're constructed in the West, because they have very specific mandates. At the time, there was very little mission bleed, and they're not wildly funded. In other words, their administrative capacities, guys weren't showing up to work in S-Class Mercedes-Benzes, like they were, I should say, at the unions. Tragically, the labor movement in South Africa, much the same way as in America, was discredited because the unions were captured by the state as well.
Right?
So you had no labor organizing, and that's another key part of state capture. And Trump And Musk and all the other guys can thank the Democrats for that just as much as anybody else. There is no real organized labor left in the United States, and that is going to have to rebuild very, very quickly.
As the aircraft is flying.
As the aircraft is flying. Yeah, figure out how to unionize the flight attendants. It's not that easy. So without organized labor, which was the big driving force that brought down apartheid, civil society and business had to figure out how to stop the existential threat, and I do mean the existential threat, that was Jacob Zuma and his cabal. So, in other words, they had to capture state capture. And they managed to do it. It was absolutely nail-biting. But at the end, a sort of acceptable to the center-right business candidate named Cyril Ramaphosa became the president of the ANC, and 2 years later became president. Pardon me, not 2 years later. Well, 2 years later, he was voted in as president of the country.
And so where are we today in terms of the fight against state capture, if that's the right way of putting it, in terms of the levels of corruption, the healing process, fixing the airplane, and what has happened to the Guptas and to Jacob Zuma?
So the Guptas so far have evaded prosecution. Obviously, they fled the country. They went to another of the United States' best friends, the United Arab Emirates, where, of course, there were at the time was no extradition agreement with South Africa. And basically, they've been running ever since. Ironically, the only people to really go after them is the US SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, because they did conduct some of their business in US dollars, some of their corrupt business in US dollars. So the SEC was targeting them for a while. But of course, the SEC's days are numbered as well in the United States. Yeah, which is another sort of tragedy for international corruption. But while the Guptas have dodged prison, and while a number of Jacob Zuma's other allies have dodged prison, and while one could say that there hasn't been any real meaningful justice, what has happened is that an opportunity was given to the state to reform. Now, for the first half of Cyril Ramaphosa's presidency, he did very little about that. So while promising to reform, really what he was trying to do was hold his ANC coalition together. But while that was happening, at the polls, support was cratering for the ANC. And so come our latest election last year, the ANC, for the first time in its history, failed to win a majority. And in order to govern, had to cobble together what has become known as a government of national unity, which is really a coalition government.
Right.
So that is an option that's available to South Africa in this parliamentary system that we have. So it is now governing with the second biggest party, the Democratic Alliance, which I guess its mandate comes from the white population and the colored or mixed race population. Colored is not a pejorative term in South Africa, by the way. It's a term that refers to mixed race South Africans. So that's where they draw their mandate, and a bunch of other parties, but not parties that are now associated with Jacob Zuma, who unbelievably came back to life, like another fellow we may be holding in the back of our minds right now, came back to life to form the MK party, which is a party based in Jacob Zuma's sort of battleground of KwaZulu-Natal. And that came back and won an enormous amount of seats in this last election.
And just for the non-South African, MK is Umkhonto weSizwe, right? It's the Spear of the Nation, which was the name of the ANC's armed wing during the struggle against apartheid. So it's a name that was chosen very carefully.
Very carefully, and might be considered a troll against the ANC. I'm going to remain in the party, said Jacob Zuma. I'm going to start my own party. I'm going to name it after the ANC's military wing, and let's see what you do about it. Right. And so the MK was enormously successful, but of course itself is just one big mafia. It's an extraction machine designed to steal as much as it possibly can from KwaZulu-Natal and some other municipalities around the country. It offers no real program outside of nationalist chauvinism.
So is it support amongst people who are not actually feeding at the trough because of it? Is it because of that sort of religious aspect of Jacob Zuma?
Yes,
that
absolutely. The spiritual attachment to the patriarch, which, as you're seeing in the United States, defies all reason. Separating the love for Jacob Zuma from rational decision making is very easy. But nonetheless, there he is. He's back in a way in South African politics. But the real story in South African politics right now is not Jacob Zuma. The real story is rebuilding after the years of state capture and finding a way through the geopolitical morass. The threats that South Africa face right now are extreme. First of all, there's the very real economic decline that has happened from state capture. There's the very real decline that has happened in national unity from state capture. There are versions of the culture wars that are playing out in South Africa now with the rising voice of Afrikaner nationalism, which has now joined the coalition of white supremacists Americans.
And this is the bunch of people that Elon Musk and Donald Trump are voicing support for and have even offered some kind of asylum in the United States, right?
Exactly. So, as I said earlier, where there's a culture war, look underneath it for what is really happening. And what is really happening is that the United States now conceives of itself, or under Trump, conceives of itself as a sort of Russia, as a neo-imperial extraction machine that is indiscernible from a kind of roving imperial business.
Right.
Right. And South Africa, being one of the most mineral-rich countries on the planet, should be very wary of U.S. interest in any form at this stage.
There's a lot to extract.
Yeah. So going back to the arms deal, had some of those bombs, guns, submarines, and boats actually worked, they would probably come in useful right now. South Africa has also started some mild adventurism and so-called peacekeeping north of us, most notably right now in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, where in the east, there has effectively been another sort of imperial incursion from Rwanda, which is starting to see itself as another of these versions of kind of a local Russia, where it is going out, securing as much mineral wealth as it possibly can from its neighbors, and doing that with a highly efficient, quite brutal military force. So all of a sudden, there are now other actors in Africa with imperial ambitions as well. So this is where South Africa finds itself right now, severely weakened by state capture, severely under the gun from new, unprecedented geopolitical pressures, and having to rebuild the plane while the plane is in the air.
Do you have any optimism, or can you offer me hope, Richard?
Yes.
For South Africa, at least. We'll talk about America next.
I find the current geopolitical situation as an unprecedented opportunity for countries to grow up, and South Africa in particular to grow up. What happens now is that there is no choice but to clean up the house or we're gone.
Right.
So, we learned today that the AIDS funding that was provided by the George W. Bush administration, called PEPFAR, has been completely rescinded. So there was this feeling during the Bush administration that because access to AIDS drugs was so expensive, there was at the time it was actually a religious impetus to the sort of noblesse oblige to come into African countries and provide HIV AIDS services. And that was PEPFAR, and it was, without question, probably the most successful aid program in U.S. history. Today, that has come to a definitive end. So all our HIV AIDS programs right now are our responsibility. There is no more money coming in from organizations like USAID. There is no more money coming from American largesse at all. We know that any trade agreements currently existing with the US will need to be renegotiated at possibly punitive terms. But we have relationships with the East. We have relationships with China. We have relationships with other Turkey. We have relationships that can be used to weigh against American hegemony. So that's where we are right now. We're at the point where we can take control of our own house. The pressures are 100% existential. If we don't wake up now, we will never wake up. Take control of our mineral wealth. Look at providing value chains. Look at reestablishing a manufacturing sector. Look at professionalizing everything that was broken during the state capture era. I don't like using the term privatize because it is not a panacea and it doesn't solve every problem. But I do use the term professionalize, where state and the private sector can form coalitions to get the country moving again and to make it a very successful player in the post-liberal New World Order.
And I mean, that could almost be a stump speech, Richard. Do you think there is, I mean, you're not alone, I assume. There is a feeling in society that this is possible now. Is that something in there?
I weirdly, as daft and as disassociated as our president, Cyril Ramaphosa, can seem, the funny thing about him is that he is actually a businessman. And I think he understands what is happening.
And he's one who hasn't gone bankrupt, as far as I know.
No, he hasn't gone bankrupt before. Sometimes there really is enough money not to go bankrupt, especially if you're not in the real estate game. So I think he understands what's going on. Most of the people in the ANC really are, and I mean this with all due respect, are too disassociated, are too far in their own bubble, have their heads too far up their own asses to really understand what is happening. South African liberals are wandering around like, if I may be a little crude, lost farts in a perfume factory. The South African media still doesn't quite get it, that we're in a new world order. There's still some kind of residual attachment to January 19, 2025, but it's all over. And so I think that this is starting to settle in.
Yeah.
If the Germans now understand it, of all people, then I think hopefully the message is getting through to the South Africans as well.
Right.
If this opportunity is not grasped, if what I have described is not done, then South Africa, like much else of the world, will become these sort of rump outposts of neo-colonial and neo-imperial extraction. The guys doing the extracting, your Russians, your Trump-aligned Americans, do not care about the welfare of South Africans. Not one bit. They don't care about the welfare of Americans. So hopefully we're awake. Hopefully we're aware of the New World Order. And with that, we could take the wheel.
Well, that's not 100% optimistic, but at least you do leave me with a little hope. So that's good. I want to ask one more question to finish this off, which is Elon Musk grew up in the same time, really, in similar circumstances as you and me, although I don't know about your parents, but mine didn't have a yacht and a plane and weren't emerald smugglers.
No.
But the other people who have a similar background and are currently active in United States politics and media and big money are David Sachs, Rudolf Botha, who's the grandson of Puk Botha, who was the foreign minister in the apartheid government, Peter Thiel, who spent time mostly, I think, in what was then Southwest Africa, now known as Namibia. And interestingly enough, a Chinese South African, Patrick Soon-Shiong, who has bought the LA Times. He's a bit older. But is there some superpower we South Africans have? And if so, why are you and me not currently taking over the United States?
Jeremy, I don't know. I think we slept on it, mate. We had it and we let it go. What is the superpower that these South Africans have? There is something enormously alluring about transforming apartheid onto a country the size, scale, and complexity of the United States. Built into the notion of apartheid was a highly libertarian notion of separate but equal, right? We run the government, right? We run the federal government as the mechanism of violence. We hold the monopoly of violence, and we are the final arbiter of what happens and what doesn't happen. What we can't see, we don't care about. On top of that, you have this notion of the Bantustans, the homelands, which in their own way were kind of, if you think about it, hyper-libertarian independent states, like the ideal of what Texas might be, or of what Tennessee might be. Armed, militia-led, states that can do their own thing, but the buck stops with the federal government, who effectively run a cultural regime that is white supremacist, that defines the terms of culture, but ultimately holds the monopoly of violence. And so there's something very, very alluring about what apartheid, or the actual mechanics of apartheid, transporting them onto the United States in whole or in part, and setting up the states as sort of independent Bantustans. Some will fail, some will succeed. It's up to them. But the guys who get really, really rich, and the guys who run the show, and the guys who define the culture, are all in DC, or in this case in Florida. And it's a beautiful thing if you can make it work. Look, Jimmy, I want to say this. The fight you guys have ahead of you is not an enviable one. But I think, again, it's best to look at it as an opportunity. The pre-Trump era was unsustainable in the United States. It was too unfair. It was too imbalanced. It's simply, liberalism to an extent had failed. And all of the veneers of democratic engagement in the United States had grown sclerotic, in my opinion. And it was time for a reset. And
Right.
this will show the character of the American people. And the fight, real as it might be, hard as it might be, brutal as it might be, and coming out of the other side will be tough. But it's going to be really, really interesting to see what the actual character of the country is at this point.
Okay. Amazing. And I hope that especially our American listeners will be able to take away some lessons from that. One thing I'd like to end this by saying is that it feels to me at the moment in the United States a bit like there's a small group of people who are screaming at the top of their heads, screaming at the top of their voices about what is going on in the country, that there's essentially a coup going on and that things are never going to be the same again. But most people aren't aware of it yet. They're wandering around as if in a dream. I still hear people say, oh, well, in 4 years' time, we'll have another chance.
No.
And I'm like, no, there's not going to be a normal election in 4 years' time. Forget about it. It's probably going to be President Barron Trump with Supreme Prime Minister and Cosmic King Elon Musk behind him. I mean, that's probably what we're looking at. So I think the struggle is going to be long here.
Yes, it will be. I think making assumptions about midterm elections or another general election in the United States is insane. I think you guys are going to have to fight for that. And as real as it will get, it's always important to remember, I think, and I think this is one of the lessons I've learned from South Africa. I don't speak here out of some sort of omniscient knowledge. I'm not anointed by God to explain America to Americans, but I think it's an everyday fight. I think what we so badly wanted to do in South Africa after the end of apartheid was just chill out, relax. Yeah. In South Africa, we say braai, barbecue. We wanted to braai, we wanted to watch the rugby or the soccer, and we just wanted to chill, man.
Yeah.
We didn't want to have to be vigilant.
Yeah.
24/7. And that's what we needed to be. And that's what we have to be. And I guess that exhausting element of democracy is what so many people are willing to relinquish until they find that it's gone. And then the trouble really starts.
Okay. Thank you, Richard.
Jeremy, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for having me on.
The Rhyming Chaos podcast is produced by me, Jeremy Goldkorn. The theme music is Eric Satie's Gymnopédie No. 1, arranged and performed by Wu Fei. Our cover art is by Li Yunfei. Subscribe to Rhyming Chaos wherever you get your podcasts and check out our newsletter at rhymingchaos.com.